Okay, so Amy comes to us from the University of Winchester. She is a fourth-year part-time PhD student in history and heritage, and her PhD project explores the construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction of Stuart kings and queens in heritage sites, specifically examining the narratives of James VI and I, Anna of Denmark, Charles I, Henrietta Maria, Charles II, and Catherine of Braganza. As I say, she will be talking on gender and sexuality case studies, representations in museums. So I will hand it over to Amy.
Thank you, Jo. So just apologies in advance, everyone, if I end up going off and having a coughing fit. As of this morning, I tested positive with COVID, so I'm just going to crack on and hopefully we'll all be fine. So thank you again, everyone, for coming to this year's Centre for Gender Studies PGR Symposium, hosted by the University of Winchester. We haven't had it for a couple of years, and normally it would be in person, and we decided let's try something new this year, so it's really exciting to see so many people here from all different universities and things. So I'm very excited to kick off today's proceedings with a short presentation which explores and reflects on how gender and sexuality is represented within museums and heritage sites. Now, the talk is based on one that I actually gave at the start of my PhD research over 4 years ago. So I'm going to start by laying out the case studies and the arguments that I presented there before going on to look at how some of these things have changed and developed since then. So I'll end by highlighting some positives and negatives, as well as posing several questions, which I hope are going to be likely common themes that we're going to see throughout the papers over the course of the symposium this Monday and next Monday. So before I start, I just wanted to recognise that although the majority of the sites explored in this paper are based in England or the UK, I'm very open to discussing any thoughts anyone has afterwards about examples and practices elsewhere. But this focus is just influenced by my own experiences working in heritage sites in England, rather than a purposeful ignorance of other heritage sites around the world. So before we get started, I'm just going to talk briefly about terminology that I'll be using in this presentation. So it's really important to say here that terms such as LGBTQIA+, BAME, homosexual, heterosexual, and so on did not exist in the past, and therefore people living in the past did not use these terms when describing or understanding their own identities. However, in modern museums, heritage sites, fictional literature, film, and so on, these terms are often used to emphasise a connection between the past and the present, and to make the central themes of projects, events, and projects more recognisable to modern consumers, be that as a visitor, a reader, a watcher, or a participant. So, for example, a museum may offer an LGBTQIA+ tour, where the historical figures discussed lived prior to the 19th century, when modern Western categorizations of sexuality began to develop, while still framing it as an LGBTQIA+ tour to highlight its central themes of gender and sexuality. It's also important to recognise that terminology is constantly developing. So, for example, many of the core titles and working groups that I'm going to discuss in this paper, the terminology that they use may already feel or be deemed outdated. So, for example, a lot of them use shorter acronyms such as LGBT, which to some people may feel exclusionary. But this should be seen to reflect the moment in which these projects were first instigated, and in themselves should not be seen as a direct attack or attempt by museums or heritage sites to erase specific narratives. So when I first created this presentation, I'd seen very few examples of written interpretation, such as label text, wall text, and introductory panels within museums that discussed LGBTQIA+ narratives. So there'd been a few, some on National Trust properties, which I'm going to be discussing later, but for the most part, these narratives, as we'll see, were largely confined to additional interpretation, such as leaflets and guided tours. So you can imagine my joy then, when a few weeks ago I walked into the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and not only found that they were hosting an exhibition entitled Gender, Sexuality and Power as part of their Bridging Binaries programme, but also that the images on the screen were one of the first pieces of text that greeted the visitor. I bring this up to reinforce some important points in regards to terminology. Firstly, the line that states, quote, "We're using LGBTIQA+ after consultation with community members, but other contributors have chosen alternative variations." This is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, because community members have been involved throughout the curation of this exhibition. And secondly, it demonstrates that every person's identity is their own and individual. And it also highlights, as we've said before, that language and terminology is developing all the time and constantly changing. For many people, for example, they still find it difficult to hear and use certain words, such as queer, due to their own past and connected personal traumas. So although queering the museum as a terminology and methodology has gained increasing popularity in the last few years, when I was sitting in a conference in gender and sexuality back in 2018, when the presenter argued for this terminology, we still saw a room very divided. So with this in mind, Joanna and I just want to remind everyone again that this symposium is a safe and respectful place, and to encourage you to get in touch with us if you've got any concerns about anything during the 2 days. So moving on to why museums and heritage sites. These spaces are fascinating as they act as conduits to the past, but are created by the various presents through which they have existed. Presents with different attitudes and interests in gender, sexuality, race, class, religion, education, health and well-being, and so on, all topics which we'll be covering in the symposium. The presents can leave their indelible or almost indelible mark on these heritage sites, on the collections themselves, and on how these sites and the collections are reinterpreted and presented to modern day audiences. Oh, sorry, wrong screen. Furthermore, museums and heritage sites can be seen as legitimate spaces to educate people, and therefore the narratives that are found within these spaces, as well as the spaces themselves, are not and indeed cannot be neutral. When I first started to explore this topic in 2016, and then later devised my original paper in 2018, COVID-19, with its global reach and resounding aftershocks, had not yet happened, and the effects of Brexit were not yet known. Nor had the horrific murders of George Floyd and Sarah Everard brought the Black Lives Matter and gender equality movements back to the fore of national and international news, or led to further protests and calls to defund the police and reclaim the night. The debate around restitution in museums, that is, museums returning objects stolen during periods of invasion and colonialism, seemed to centre only on the British Museum, and more specifically on calls to return the Parthenon marbles to Greece, a debate that had actually been raging for decades. Working in the heritage sector in a national museum in London from 2016 to 2018, there seemed instead an almost cautious but buoyant feeling of optimism, that despite the coming of Brexit, a difference could be made within these educational settings, and that the hard work and dedication put in would lead to, in the not too distant future, a great and wondrous change. 2018 marked the centenary of the Representation of the People's Act, which gave a limited group of women and more men the right to vote in the UK. And in 2017, it marked in England at least 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality. Pride events were on the rise, with 23 countries having made same-sex marriage legal, and 3 of these taking place in 2017 itself. And it is in this context that the heritage site examples that I'm about to examine were conceived. These anniversaries provided an ideal opportunity for museums and heritage sites to try to shrug off or challenge previous representations of history, largely dominated by white upper-class cishet men, and bring narratives to the fore that had previously been underrepresented within these institutions. By embracing these narratives, museums and heritage sites not only aim to make themselves more applicable and appealing to the 21st century audience, but also give themselves a commercial edge, encouraging visitors to come and view their temporary exhibitions or revamped narratives. Although some people expressed fears that discussing sexuality and gender in these spaces would lead to a drop in visitors and memberships, these were quickly dispelled. While some, a vocal minority of right-wing people, may have cancelled their memberships, complained, or taken to social media to attack passionate researchers who had dedicated their time to exploring these previously hidden or ignored narratives, these events were in reality hugely successful. The National Trust Prejudice and Pride event, for example, saw a direct correlation between the inclusion of these narratives and a dramatic increase in their membership, with many citing the Trust efforts as reasons to visit and to engage. So it's with this context in mind that I'm going to move on to some of the case studies of the events that were put on from 2016 to 18 in heritage spaces that explored the themes of gender and sexuality. So, first up, in 2018, International Women's Day felt particularly significant due to the anniversary of the Representation of the People's Act. The Victoria and Albert Museum, which will from now on be called the V&A in this paper, held various small events as part of Women's History Month and International Women's Day. For example, the marketing team decided that they would announce their upcoming exhibition, Frida Kahlo Making Herself Up, on International Women's Day, to make use of that kind of social media presence around women's history. However, it was felt by the Visitor Experience Department that the events planned were not wide-reaching enough, nor did they harness the passion and knowledge of the museum's large front-of-house team, which included both gallery staff and volunteers. Now, with the determination to increase women's narrative within the museum, as well as offer opportunities to the multi-talented and often overlooked gallery teams, the Visitor Experience administrators, with the support of the managers and supervisors, planned and implemented a week celebration, which included volunteer tours, performances by local women's choirs and a female DJ, and 10-minute object tours by gallery assistants. Now, the structure of the V&A meant that events such as these were often created and organised by the events and learning departments with support from marketing and interpretation. Whilst there were several events around the centenary, the administrators felt that the events had no real focus, and that whilst the other departments were continually failing to utilise the skills of the Visitor Experience team, they could do something about this and reach the visitors on a more ad hoc level. So the most resounding effect of the International Women's Day events that they put on was that in 2019, the V&A launched its Female Voices tours. The volunteer tours of the year before had been used as a trial to demonstrate the need and enthusiasm for women's tours to be added to an already busy permanent tour schedule. When I first presented this paper, the announcement of this permanence was hot off the press, an exciting milestone that saw the tours join the museum's LGBTQ+ and BAME tours, which were already in existence. However, as with many additional events within heritage sites, these tours were suspended due to COVID-19, and the V&A's tour schedule is only just starting to re-emerge. Further, with front-of-house staff numbers cut dramatically and related departmental restructures, it's perhaps unlikely that a programme of this scale will be reintroduced and run again. The V&A also celebrates LGBTQIA+ narratives within the museum, hosting LGBTQ tours and having its own LGBTQ working group comprised of museum staff, including volunteers, who have an interest in using the museum's collections to explore gender, sexuality and identity. Alongside the tours, the working group also produced the Out on Display guide, the front cover of which is shown here, which highlights over 30 objects currently on display with a variety of LGBTQ connections and narratives, including objects created in a variety of artistic mediums and across a time span from ancient Romans to modern day. Now, this guide can be downloaded and still can be from the V&A's website, which makes it accessible even to those not visiting the museum in person. However, prior to the pandemic, the guide was not consistently printed by the museum and was therefore not available at the main desk with the other leaflets, which can be seen to limit its reach. Ongoing COVID restrictions, along with reduced staff members and the need to cut costs, also means that these leaflets are now less likely to be available at the museum. The other problem was that there was no additional indication on the labels of the objects to help you follow this tour, which can be seen as another way of it having a limited reach overall. So the British Museum also represents LGBTQIA+ narratives within its collections. So based off Richard B. Parkinson's book, A Little Gay History, Desire and Diversity Across the World, and programmed to coincide with 50 years since the Sexual Offences Act, the British Museum hosted an exhibition and a trail in 2017. The exhibition later went on tour to regional museums such as the Ashmolean in Oxford and the National Justice Museum in Nottingham. The original trail, which only contained 13 objects, included items such as busts of Hadrian and Antinous and chocolate cups and saucers, which depicted the ladies of Llangollen, which I always struggle to say, so I'm sorry to any Welsh speakers. So following on from its success, the British Museum created a trail which contained 15 objects and was specifically designed so that you could see it comfortably in a single visit. Furthermore, they then created additional content that could be downloaded onto your own device, and you can access all this information online. So I've yet to follow the trail since the pandemic, but certainly prior to this, there were additional stickers on the labels of the related objects that signposted visitors to their place in the trail, which, as we saw a moment ago, is a limitation of the similar trail at the V&A. So it would be interesting, therefore, to return and evaluate the trail again as the British Museum, even outside the pandemic, are quite notorious for closing off specific gallery spaces due to staffing issues and the age of the building. So as the most visited museum in the UK and an internationally recognisable institution, it's vital that places like the British Museum show themselves to be challenging conventions and embracing a variety of narratives and exploring all the different histories connected to their collections. What is interesting to reflect on here is that whilst they do a very good job at exploring narratives of gender and sexuality, the institution still has a long way to go in terms of decolonising the museum and of course, returning objects stolen in the past. So around the time of the events at the British Museum and the V&A, the Tate also had a rethink about its interpretation. To uncover the narratives previously underexplored within their collections, the team at the Tate added additional label text about women and members of the LGBTQIA+ and BAME communities at the Tate Britain. Now, these were added alongside previous texts accompanying objects in their galleries, and they were colour-coded, which allowed all visitors to the gallery to explore a variety of themes without the need to attend a particular tour or workshop. However, when labels relating to the history of people who were enslaved were added to their Baroque Power and Illusion exhibition in 2020, they used stands rather than integrating the information into the label text or placing it physically on the wall next to the object. And this led to visitors expressing anger, feeling that the museum was adding these narratives as an afterthought, whilst continuing to privilege the narratives of colonialists. The National Trust also saw 2017 as an ideal year to revisit the past of its properties in a way that placed it more firmly in the 21st century. The Trust stated that, quote, many of our places were home to and shaped by people who challenged conventional ideas of gender and sexuality. In 2017, 50 years after the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, we explore our LGBTQ heritage with a programme called Prejudice and Pride, end quote. Now, the programme explored these narratives at a number of sites, including Benonborough Hall in Yorkshire, Felbury Hall in Norwich, and Hanbury Hall in Worcestershire. The events included artists in residence and explored the secret sexual stories hidden in the art of their properties. Furthermore, the project was supported by celebrities such as Stephen Fry, who narrated a short film, and a podcast series by Claire Balding. Now, the programme was also seen as a chance for the National Trust to test drive this new type of project, not only different in its content and theme than the Trust's previous work, but also different in terms of approach taken across key sites in the National Trust, and the important research and interpretation work that it both enabled and produced. Now, following on from its success, the Trust left much of the newly updated interpretation in place at these sites, and made plans to move forward with a similar project, Colonial Countryside, which would decolonise their sites, recognising the complex past of their properties and these places' relationship to the exploitation of people who were enslaved. Now, this project, as some of you will have seen, has led to right-wing leaning people hurling outraged comments at the National Trust, and in particular the head of the project, Dr. Connie Fowler. It's been a difficult couple of years for heritage sites anyway, due to the pandemic, but the hope remains that Colonial Countryside will have the same effect as the Trust's Prejudice and Pride programme, where a very small minority vocally complained and abandoned ship, but where membership actually dramatically increased, and that the Trust's thought-provoking and engaging research led to a more diverse visitor demographic and encouraged the acknowledgement of previously hidden narratives. So in my original paper, I also included a case study from outside the UK, and I think it's probably more important than ever to include it here again. So between April and October 2017 in the Prado in Madrid, they redisplayed their objects from their permanent collection to create, quote, a new focus of its permanent collection through the specifically devised thematic itinerary of works that encourages a reflection on the historical reality of same-sex relationships and non-normative sexual desires, end quote. Now, 2017 was particularly significant for Spain's LGBTQIA+ community, as it had marked the 40th anniversary of the first Pride protest in the country, which had been held in Madrid. Now, the title of this redisplay of its pre-existing collection was The Other's Gazes, Spaces of Difference, and was curated as part of World Pride Madrid. The event gave visitors the opportunity to explore 4 different routes, which were independent but interrelated, and included art from the classical world right up to the 1600s. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the trip to Madrid to analyse the redisplay, but what struck me when exploring the exhibition online was that, like the British Museum, V&A, and countless other interpretations I had seen, there was a clear lack of women and female sexuality reflected in the objects chosen. So I'm going to move on now to some conclusions that I first made when I gave this paper. So to start with, I questioned, as I mentioned a moment ago, where are the women? Evidence of female sexuality is often harder to find due to the lack of recording it in the past, and as laws that govern male same-sex relations often did not apply to women in the same way, therefore meaning that evidence is also missing from the various court records which often illuminate male sexuality. What has changed since I gave this presentation is the drive to represent historical female sexuality more on screen. So, for example, the airing of the first series of BBC Gentleman's Jack has happened in that time, which has led to an increase in talks about Anne Lister and Anne Walker's life together, as well as increased social media activity, especially around the transcription and analysis of Anne Walker's diaries. Now, in terms of women's history in museums, back in 2018, I pointed out that in London's National Gallery, women only made up 26 pieces of their collection. Since this paper was first given, this number has increased slightly, and the gallery has worked hard to both expand its female artistic narratives it includes. For example, it recently held the Artemisia Gentileschi exhibition, and to share artworks by female artists on a greater scale within different locations in England and Scotland. So when the gallery acquired Artemisia's painting of St. Catherine, which we can see on the screen, this was put on display first at the National Gallery and then went on tour at places such as Glasgow's Women's Library, a GP surgery and a prison. However, the fact remains that women's narratives are still vastly outnumbered within museums and heritage sites. I also argued that there could be seen what could be termed a prescribed set of historical and mythological figures that are deemed central to the examination of LGBTQIA+ histories in heritage sites. With nearly all the sites I explored in this paper having included people like Oscar Wilde, Hadrian and Antinous, St. Sebastian and Ganymede. This prescribed set may increase visitor numbers due to pre-existing knowledge and its power to attract initial engagement, but these are narratives that are presented as white and male, and therefore ignore other experiences of sexuality outside an assumed visibly male and European context. The other issue with many of the events and projects discussed in this paper were their temporary nature. As shown, some of these became more permanent in time, and these early temporary events were a key part of the development of these large projects. But many were fleeting and required the visitor to be in the right place at the right time with the ability to engage in a specific way. There was, of course, a number of positives in the conclusion of my original paper, including that museums were and continue to take steps to incorporate these previously underrepresented histories into their public spaces. And as discussed at the beginning of this paper, as museums can be seen as legitimate spaces for engagement and education, by incorporating these narratives into their spaces, a new space for exploration, reflection and learning can be created. These spaces are not only important to members of the communities who often for the first time can see their own lived experiences reflected in these environments, but also for those outside of these communities who have not engaged, often through no decisive action of their own, with these narratives before. In this way, these spaces can bring people together to explore histories that have always been there, but have not previously been openly present in these spaces. So, having weighed up the positives and negatives, I then made 3 simplified suggestions of what could be changed and improved on. These conclusions were very much based on my time within visitor experience and called for a more holistic approach within institutions themselves. They argued that heritage sites should plan to utilise people's passions and skills within underrepresented teams, especially in larger museums, for example, front of house teams, and should link teams and institutions to create more collaborative projects. They also pointed out the great elephant in the heritage environment, or even then, of funding and the related priorities of upper management. Whilst I still agree with the first conclusions I made 4 years ago, I'd like to add some more and to broaden their scope. Firstly, to revisit my ideas around the prescribed set and my recent visit to the Pitt Rivers Museum and their exhibition on gender, sexuality and power. Now, something struck me in that space that challenged my idea of the prescribed set. Now, although I had never argued that the prescribed set was entirely negative, I did see that it held the possibility for restricting how LGBTQIA+ narratives within museums and heritage sites are represented, and that the list was particularly lacking in female and non-white representation. At the Pitt Rivers, I saw a different interpretation of the same question. Here, my prescribed set was presented as objects of power, as, quote, a range of historical and contemporary objects featuring well-known mythological and religious figures that can be used to tell LGBTIAQ plus stories, end quote. Now, the interpretation text that you see on the screen talks about the various meanings and power that people in those communities may attach to these historical, mythological, and religious figures. In my prescribed set, I was largely talking about objects Western and European museums were likely to have access to, which they could use to easily construct a sense of an LGBTQI plus inclusion within their spaces without significant amounts of research. Now, in the Pitt Rivers, the focus was instead on individuals and the construction of more recent communities, with the use of these narratives being used to, quote, create alternative models of families and communities, end quote. Seeing this at first made me feel uncomfortable, wondering if I had so obviously missed the point of these figures' inclusion in the examples that I've discussed within this paper. On reflection, however, I would argue that these two different ideas and interpretations should be and can be interwoven. Perhaps the inclusion of these figures within my earlier museum trips had been inspired by community members expressing their own personal connections to these narratives. But even so, it has created a group of easily identifiable LGBTQIA plus figures that museums can search for within their collections and can place in the spotlight for tours, trails and talks without the need for extensive new research. Now, the Pitt Rivers exhibition, though relatively small, did an amazing job discussing terminology, intersectionality, colonialism, activism, and including far more women than I had seen elsewhere in similar exhibitions. With the opening of the UK's first National Queer Museum, we can continue to hope for better representation, understanding and reconstructions of LGBTQIA plus narratives in museums and heritage spaces. As mentioned previously in this paper, COVID-19 and its related financial strains have dramatically affected heritage sites and have in many cases led to reductions in staffing, reorganisations of institutions, and continues to have a dramatic effect on visitor numbers. Even as the government insists that the risks of COVID-19 is decreasing, the full long-term effects on society, on work, on health and well-being and so on are yet to be seen. The pandemic has exposed harsh inequalities and highlighted more than ever the ableism that exists within our society and within the workplace. There are things that should be learned from the last 2 years and plans that should be put in place having reflected on them, which again might be a theme that we see throughout some of the other papers in the symposium. As touched on during the course of this discussion, there are also the perception that politics, the government and popular opinion is becoming more right-wing. Whether this is true or long-lasting is yet to be seen, but it can be argued that people with right-wing attitudes are becoming more vocal, making it appear that the vocal minority is evolving into the vocal majority. This is not only scary for those of us who hope to work together towards greater equality, but also has the possibility of disrupting movements that aim for diversification, which includes those in heritage sites explored here. Now, as discussed in my original conclusion to this paper, funding remains a major issue, and this is not only in heritage sites, but also in other educational settings, in medical care, policymaking, social care, research, and a huge variety of other environments. So within heritage itself, and I'm sure within other areas that are going to be discussed in the symposium, there is a huge reliance on unpaid volunteers and on cheap student or underqualified labour. This links well to my final point, another that I made in my original presentation, that people passion is key in these situations. People passion in this context is the passion that pushes a person to pursue an activity or aim for a goal that they care deeply about. These people often focus on what can be rather than what is, which leads them to work with great determination to alter or improve a situation. Now, people passion is often the backbone of many charitable works and social political campaigns. However, a project that relies completely or even partially on people passion can be incredibly problematic, especially in the context of museums and heritage sites. For example, passion often pushes people to volunteer, but to volunteer, a person usually has to have a certain set of personal privileges that allow them to give up their time and energy for free. This can lead to an imbalance of people represented within museum spaces, and is one of the reasons why cuts to museum funding in the last few years is particularly worrying in relation to equality and diversity. People passion is a double-edged sword that I'm sure many of us have found ourselves dangerously teetering towards the negative side of. Without people passion, the staff and volunteers of the museums explored within this talk would never have created the outstanding projects that they did. Further, as these projects often relied on this people passion, many of the limitations that can be seen within them can often be put down to people having to coordinate them on top of their everyday work activities as extras, which the museum could shout proudly about, but won't necessarily be able to allot a sensible amount of time to. So amazing leaps are still being made, however, with the first LGBTQIA+ museum in the UK, Queer Britain, whose Twitter you can see here, opening in the spring. It will be in King's Cross, if anyone's familiar. And a whole host of books on queer in the museum and gender and sexuality in museums are now in existence. I've also included another tweet here if anyone is interested in the LGBTQ+ tours at the V&A. They are coming back. Which was announced very recently. So at this year's Winchester Centre for Gender Studies Symposium, PGR students from across the world are presenting on a huge variety of topics which explore gender and sexuality and showcase the fantastic research that is currently being undertaken and providing a rich and exciting look into what is to come in the future. So maybe it'll all be okay. But thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing all your papers. I will stop sharing now.